Okay, welcome. Last week we spoke about the prophets of the 8th and 7th century before the fall of Jerusalem. We talked about the warnings they gave the people, warnings that there should be more concentration. Let me see, let me get this right. Okay, more concentration on justice, on feeding the poor, on distributing land properly, etc., etc. These warnings were, of course, not heeded, and the Jerusalem, first Israel and then Judah, fell to foreign conquerors. So today, then, we are going to talk about prophecy in exile. And we'll be talking about figures like Ezekiel and second and third Isaiah. All right, how did this happen? Well, uh, the northern kingdom, Israel, fell in 0734. Finally, several deportations, 734, 732, and 722. And those are those red lines at the top here. So that's where the deportations um, came from. All right. And then in 604, between 604 and 587, when Judah fell to Nebuchadnezzar, uh, there were deportations to Babylon. However, these deportations worked out very, very differently for Israel and for Judah, as we'll see. So, 722, Samaria, the last city in the kingdom of Israel, falls to Assyria. Now, it's the elites who are deported, maybe 10% of the population. These are the highly educated people, the priests, the craftsmen, people like that. Mhm. Make some technical adjustments here. Okay, the deportees apparently lose their identity and they are absorbed into the surrounding population. Now, this is a problem that immigrants have all over the world. How do you maintain your cultural identity? How do you maintain your customs in the midst of an alien society? Well, new peoples were given land in Israel. Um, the new people acknowledge Yahweh as their chief God, but not the exclusive God. And this was somewhat consistent with what was happening in Israel anyway. So a distinct form of Judaism evolves, and this will later lead to conflicts. All right. Further, refugees pour into Judah. Now, the refugees into Judah, Israel has its own literature, and Judah has its own literature, and they begin to merge. So the Pentateuch, as we know it today, is beginning to form from the combination of the Israeli and the Judean literature. Now, the fall of Judah. So there's three separate deportations, 598, 586, and 582. And that's somewhere between 20 and 80,000 people. Nobody knows for sure, but probably 20% of the population. Again, it's the most important people, priests, nobles, craftsmen, artisans, people like that. The rest of the people are left on the land to farm the land, provide food for the empire, and basically to be just a little bit more than slaves. But this new deported population from Judah was different from the population that was deported from Israel. Rather than disappearing into the Babylonian population, they became part of what's called the diaspora. And they struggled to maintain their cultural and religious identity in the midst of an alien culture. Now, I suspect that many of you know what that means. Many of you are immigrants from Africa, from South America, from Asia, and you know how difficult it is to maintain your traditions your language, your culture in the midst of a foreign country. Well, what was the solution? The Judean exiles settled in communities where they could maintain their traditions and customs. But the central institution, that is the temple, it was gone. And in its place, a preoccupation with customs became the glue holding the community together. So things like Sabbath observance, circumcision, this became very important, dietary laws. Okay, from the books of Esther and Tobit, we can surmise that they did quite well in captivity. By being this separate community, they sort of could help each other along. They sort of could build some actual wealth and some actual prosperity. And we know this from the banking records of Morashu. Now, these were cultures that didn't use paper much. They recorded everything on clay tablets, which were then baked. And these tablets survived for thousands and thousands of years. The It's interesting that these tablets are not so much literature or poetry, things like that. They're mostly accounting records. They're mostly bills of lading. They're mostly, well, credit cards, actually. And so, and bank records. And so the banking records of Morashu have several important Jewish depositors. So, where is the true Israel? Now, there are many refugees in Egypt. So now there are three centers of Jewish life: Egypt, Israel, and Babylon. But Hebrew theology and worship had been bound up with the land and with the temple. So could the exiles even be part of the true Israel? Now, the exiles, for their part, since they were the elites, they looked down on those who remained. The center of Jewish life and thought shifted to Babylon. After the return, as we'll see next week, they supplant the Palestinian Judeans to become something closer to modern Judaism. This required a new theology. Foundational to Hebrew thought was the promised land, a permanent kingdom, and the temple, the only place where sacrifices could be offered, and sacrifices were required for everything. These things had been part of the covenant, so a new explanation was necessary. We talk here about the Deuteronomist. Now, we've already encountered the book of Deuteronomy, discovered by Josiah in year 622. Okay, but so the work was begun under King Josiah, but it was completed in Babylon. It was completed outside of Israel. And now it was more of a look back in anger. It was the people, not Yahweh, who had violated the covenant, and especially the kings. All right, this provides the priestly source. The priests were the leaders in this Deuteronomic movement. And so the priests replace the kings as the leaders of Judaism, and they will bring their own interpretation. There's far more dependence on things that priests are interested in: cult, liturgy, and law. And they are responsible for the final, more or less, edition of the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Old Testament. But now there are new prophets. As you recall, there were conflicting prophets in the last days of Judah. And so, how were people to know the true prophets from the false? So, there were prophets who counseled rebellion, and there were prophets like Jeremiah who counseled cooperation with the Assyrians. The people became suspicious of prophecy in general. But in the exile, a new style of prophecy arises. And this begins with Ezekiel, who has these fantastic visions and a very new and original view of the individual. And then we're going to look at second Isaiah and the suffering servant, and third Isaiah and the restoration. Now you might not have known that there were actually three Isaiahs. Well, let's start with Ezekiel and his contributions because they're very important. So Ezekiel, working in Babylon 593 to 570, the um, he comes from a priestly family, and he's carried off in the first deportation of 598. So he is the first prophet that's working exclusively in Babylon. He's the first prophet without a temple or a promised land to show Yahweh's presence. And he had been of the Babylonian party, preaching submission to Babylon. Now, all of his works have this very high state of mysticism, and he performs these prodigies of asceticism. I mean, lying on one side, I think it is for something like 300 days, whatever it is, but things like that. All right, his theology. Well, he promises that Israel will be restored, but as a free gift. It now has nothing to do with the repentance of the people, because God, it will be solely the movement of God, not repaying the people for anything, but as free gifts. And he uses this phrase, then you will know that I am God, three times. So I give you this new land, okay? I restore you to the land, not because of your faithfulness or anything like that. I do it because I am God. But individual and repentance and belief replaces the communal guilt and collective guilt. So this is the introduction of individualism. Now, in tribal cultures, as Israel was, this individualism is very, very rare. But now it becomes the dominant theme of the theology. And this is a pure monotheism. Yahweh is not just the chief God, he's the only God. And there's this emphasis on purity. Now, there's also a prediction of the restoration of the Davidic kingship. However, the this is a cleaned up version of David. Now, if you remember, David, shall we say, had his faults, okay? No denying it. But in the new version, David is the ideal king, okay? And he's purged of these faults. And then they introduce the idea of the resurrection of the dead. Now, this does not appear any place before the exile. And this phrase, Son of Man, is used 93 times. So the prophets is addressed as Son of Man, which indicates both his humanity and his distance from God. Okay, the throne vision. It starts off with this complex visual and sensory experience of the throne of God. Now, it's a long passage. I won't read it, but you should read this to see just how complex this is. Okay? Ezekiel's um, first chapter, 4 through 28. But it's offered without interpretation. Now, this vision is so complex, it's never successfully represented in art. It can't be. It can represent parts of it, but not the fullness of it. It's just it can't be done. Okay, Yahweh rests on cherubim, angels, as does the ark. Well, what does this mean? Okay, this vision takes place in exile. So the presence of Yahweh, the ark, the ark moves from the temple to Babylon. So true Judaism now departs from Jerusalem and rests in Babylon. Now, there's four angels in this, and they each have four faces. Four angels with four faces. You see why it's so hard to depict in art. So the faces are human, ox, lion, and eagle. These will later be appropriated by Christians to be as symbols for the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Individual justice. He forbids the use of the sour grapes metaphor. So there's apparently a saying in Israel, the old men have eaten sour grapes and the teeth of the young are on edge. The idea was that the sins, the problems, everything is passed on from generation to generation. So we're talking about communal guilt and communal uh, responsibility. But Ezekiel says, no, now each person bears individual responsibility. Okay? No one will suffer for the sins of the father. Okay? Everybody will bear his own individual faults. This seems obvious to us because we come from an individualistic culture, but this was really new at the time. Okay, so you can contrast it with lots of other passages in the Bible. Okay, matter of fact, it was the justification for the ban. So, the enemy tribe had done something wrong, so you punish the whole tribe by killing them all, that sort of thing. Nevertheless, he holds that all of Judah will be punished, the guilty along with the innocent. Well, the truth is, Ezekiel doesn't uh, really recognize too many people as innocent anyway. But he does do something interesting. He gives us an order of the sins in their rank. All right. Um, Again, 18, 4 through 10. The first and foremost sin is idolatry, the violation of the first commandment. Then adultery and relations with a menstruating woman. Well, this has to do with purity. Okay, they were very, very concerned with uh, they, menstruating women. They sort of had a revulsion at that whole process. Um, then comes usury. Now, this is very interesting because usury was a big problem in the ancient world. It's a big problem in our world where people take payday loans or at ridiculous interest rates, or our credit cards charge 30% interest rates. Um, but we don't recognize usury. They did. And it was a big issue for them because for farmers, inability to pay the loan meant they lost the land, they lost their freedom. So usury was a very big issue. Then came just judgment. Then came observing the law of Moses. So that was the order of the importance of sins. Here's the big contribution, however, the field of dry bones. You should read this whole thing. I'm not going to read it now. But this is the first mention of the resurrection of the body in the Old Testament. So Ezekiel has this vision where he's standing in a field of just bones. And the bones, he's asked to prophesy over them, and the bones start to come together. Okay? Uh, and the bones reassembled themselves, and they're commanded to hear the word of the Lord, and they get covered with flesh, and eventually they come to life. Now, there's an interpretive question. Is this just a metaphor for the restoration of Israel from the grave of its captivity, or does it refer to individual resurrection? Well, as I read it, I don't think there's any other way to read it um, other than as resurrection. And that's certainly how it entered the theology, as resurrection of the body. Okay. Again, there's no place in the Old Testament up to this point where they talk about resurrection of the body. Now, this may be influenced by Zoroastrianism, the religion of Babylon. Zoroastrianism is a very interesting religion. Okay, it is a monotheistic religion. Monotheisms are very, very rare. We, of course, accept it as natural, but in fact, they don't happen all that often. And why? When people start looking at the natural order, they realize there must be something behind this. And so there must be a spirit behind the trees, behind the rocks, behind the rivers, behind the clouds. So you have all of these gods. That's where religion almost always starts. Monotheisms, you have Zoroastrianism, Judaism, eventually, not at the beginning, Christianity and Islam, and that's pretty much it. So of all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cults, thousands of cults, in fact, Um, those are pretty much the only monotheisms there are. Now, note the order. When you read this passage, note the order. First, the action of Yahweh, and then the belief of the people. Yahweh always initiates the action. All right. Now let's turn to this fellow, the suffering servant. This is from Second Isaiah, uh, around 550 BC. Okay, there's one, there's only one book of Isaiah in the Bible, but in fact there are three authors. So second Isaiah comes about 2 centuries after first Isaiah. And we know nothing of him other than that he was an exile. Well, how do we know it's not the same person? Well, as first Isaiah, because first Isaiah refers to the coming fall of Jerusalem, whereas second Isaiah talks about Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem as something long. They can't possibly be the same person. And he writes of the people in Babylon. Yeah, so obviously that can't be the same Isaiah as the first. And he writes of Cyrus, the king, a later king of Babylon. So Israel is frequently spoken of as Yahweh's servant. But in second Isaiah, the servant becomes a specific person. So in a long, long poem that's 6 chapters long, the servant becomes the suffering servant of Yahweh. Now, this is a very highly structured, highly literate poem. The author is obviously a very educated, a very erudite person. And it has a structure that's used in Middle Eastern literature in a lot of different places. Uh, but it's very complex. The theme is the relationship between the servant and Zion, and it reaches its climax in a discourse on justice and salvation. So it starts off with a section on the servant, in this 49, 1 through 13. Then a section on Zion, then another section on the servant. Reaches its climax in the discourse on justice and salvation. Then there's another section on Zion, then another section on the servant, and another section on Zion. All right, here's how it works. Okay, these are three pairs. They're kind of like a conversation between Zion and the servant. So there's the outer pair. So the first part is answered by the last part. And then there's the inner pair. You see, you have servant and Zion paired in both in all of these groupings. Okay, and this section on Zion is answered by the next to last section on the servant. And finally, the inner pair, the servant and Zion, and the climax in the discourse on justice and salvation. Okay, the outer pair. The servant is called by Yahweh from the womb, but he toiled in vain, or it appeared to be in vain. Yet he would be a light not just to Israel, but to all the nations. And on a day of salvation, the land will be restored, and Yahweh will comfort his people. All right. The servant now is answered in the last section as Zion is presented as the forsaken wife, the deserted wife who becomes beloved and fruitful, because your maker will become your husband, and Yahweh will never again be angry with you. And you will be taught by Yahweh and established in justice and peace. All right. Then we have the middle pair. Okay. This starts with Zion. Zion then is the bride of Yahweh. And he speaks of the tenderness of God towards Israel as the tenderness of a husband towards his bride. And the nations shall carry your children to you. He says there was never a divorce between God and Israel. As bad as things got, there was no divorce. All right, then we come back to the servant, the man of suffering. Now, the Christians took this as the Christ figure, marred beyond all human appearance. Yet it says, by his stripes we are healed. And because he submitted to death, he would see his descendants in a long line and see the fullness of days. Well, how do you make sense of that? He both submitted to death and he's playing with his grandchildren. Okay. He's died, but he sees fullness of days. Okay. Very, very hard to understand what was going on here. All right, the inner pair. The servant speaks to the weary. And the suffering of the suffering servant is described in great detail. Yet, despite his humiliation, he cannot be put to shame because Yahweh upholds him. But the people do not hear him. All right. Now, the Zion portion. Zion awakens and offers an interpretation of all the sufferings of Israel. But these sufferings will be turned against the oppressor. The good news comes to Zion, and she is led out of captivity by Zion, by Yahweh himself. And finally, there is the climax of the poem in the connection of justice and salvation. Now, I'm not going to read that here, but read that section. It's the climax of the poem. And it says, for justice, you must look to your roots. And he gives the connection between justice and salvation. And the prominence of Yahweh's justice is contrasted with the passing nature of the world. All right, so what do we have here? It's a difficult poem to interpret. At least it was for the Jews. The restoration of the kingdom, well, it was in Ezekiel, but the servant is not a king. Yet Israel is saved through his suffering. So you have two lines of prophecy here. You have the Davidic king and the suffering servant. Well, which is it? Are we talking about the servant? Or are we talking about the king? Are we talking about somebody totally humiliated? Or are we talking about somebody glorified? All right. You can see why, when the Christians saw the crucified Christ, and crucified under the name, the title there of "This is the King of the Jews," all of a sudden, the suffering servant poems made sense. Both Davidic king and suffering servant at the same time. So you see why this became so important. All right, then we have third Isaiah, okay? And it's a reflection on second Isaiah in three parts. The first part, uh, chapters 56 through 59, God alone acts as a warrior, avenger, and savior. Justice and salvation are his armor. Notice how those two always go together, justice and salvation. And since there is not one who is just, Yahweh must do it himself. Okay, we're building up here to what will become Christianity. In 60 through 63, Zion and the suffering servant, two oracles on Zion and one on the servant. Zion will be raised to glory, and the servant will announce the glad tidings. And in 63 through 66, talks about the new heavens and the new earth. Now, it's important that the paradise described here is an earthly paradise. All right. So let's look at this from the standpoint of salvation history. Judaism matures in exile. And without this exile, the Judaism that we have today, that we had at the time of Christ, could not exist. Okay? It could not have been what it became without everything they endured in exile and everything they learned, quite frankly, from the Zoroastrianism, because things like the resurrection of the body, Satan, 7 days of creation, Genesis 1 is a rewrite of Zoroastrian myths, the 7 day week, the Sabbath, all of these were part of Zoroastrianism. And the apocalypse, the final battle between good and evil. This enters the theology. Again, it comes from the time in exile in Babylon. All of these are borrowed from Zoroastrianism. But so too does legalism, genealogy, incredible genealogies, and ritual, this concentration on ritual. And so it remains an ethnic, even a tribal religion. So more development is needed. That is more history. And that's sort of the point of this whole series. So the revelation is not given all at once. It can't be given all at once. And the revelation never closes. Okay? Just as in your own life, okay, the truth is being revealed to you through your own actions, through your own experience. So the same thing is true of how Judaism developed. And as Judaism developed, so did Christianity. It develops over time, as we will see. Now, we have the fullness of revelation in Jesus Christ. Okay, there's nothing more to be added. But we do not have the fullness of understanding of that revelation. What does it mean to us? What does it mean to our country? What does it mean to our community, our family? You and I are part of salvation history. It's not something that happened a long time ago or finished a long time ago. It's something that continues into our own day and into our own life. Great. Thank you very much. Next week, we'll be talking about the return from exile and how that moved the story along. So I'll see you next week.